Andrew Scheps, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us today. Much appreciated. The first question, really broad idea. We've had heavy music for over half a century now, and from your perspective, what is heaviness?
Well, first of all, I'd argue that we've had it for hundreds of years, not recorded and not necessarily classified as heavy, but I think classical music has been heavy for a really long time. I mean, just one specific example, and it's not necessarily done as heavy, but it feels this way in the context of what's going on. The last movement of Mahler's Fourth Symphony is sort of a folk tale, a folk song, set, and there's a soprano who's singing it, and there are these pauses, and in the pauses, the orchestra plays two chords. And if you look at the score, they're power chords. It's roots and fifths spread out over 4 octaves, and that's all it is. And I think that's your clue to the musical side of it. You can go major chord, not heavy, minor chord, heavier. If you leave out the third entirely, that can be even heavier because you aren't even defining it. You're sort of leaving someone in space to realize, well, it's not happy, it must be super heavy. Like there's something going on with that. And that's more in terms of just chord structure and arrangement and all that kind of thing. But then there's the sonic element of it in the recorded music we're talking about. And I really just think that it's a matter of progression. Something is heavier than anything you've heard before then. And Back in Black is a great example of that. It sounded super heavy when it came out, and now it does not. It sounds great, and it's still a fantastic record, but it doesn't sound heavy anymore. Meshuggah sounds heavy. That doesn't. So it's this progression, and it's also the hearing something for the first time. It's the being surprised by it because, oh my God, could you do that? Well, they've just done it, so yes. But on multiple listens, you get used to it. And so part of the heaviness, I think, is the surprise of it. And that doesn't always last forever.
And you mentioned classical music there and heaviness in classical music. Do you have any perspectives on this idea, this perceptual heaviness in other genres and other musical forms in addition to classical?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's also sort of trending towards minor chords instead of major chords. That will sound heavier, not necessarily just to do with the instrumentation, but obviously you've got sad pop songs that don't necessarily sound heavy, but in hip hop, absolutely. The amount of low end and the 808 basses that are used now, distorted 808 basses, can sound ridiculously heavy. There's a Damian Marley track from years ago, something about traffic, I can't remember the title of it, and the low end is insane and it makes it feel incredibly heavy. So again, it's just the weight of it, and that can happen in pretty much any genre, I think.
In addition to that weight, from a mix perspective, what are the components that when you're mixing deliver heaviness to the listener?
Other than EQ, it's tough because, like I said before, when you're in metal, modern metal, something that's faster, so not first couple of Black Sabbath records, but more modern metal, the drums are very much about the precision, but at the same time, when you get to the toms, they have to have this low end thing to them. The kick obviously has to have some low end, but I don't do a huge amount of work in the genre. I mean, I've mixed a record for Metallica, but they are very much their own thing. And Lars' drum sound is very specific. But it's still part of it, I guess. So it is, I feel like it doesn't come as much from the drums, whereas mixing rock, that's where I find a lot of the weight of the track would be from the kick drum and the bass and figuring out who rules the low end. Whereas especially on the song we worked on for this study, it really was trying to get it to come from the guitars because they are so much louder. And in that very simple guitar arrangement, 2 guitars, left, right, you're not dealing with trying to make counter melodies happen within other parts. You're basically, and other than 8 or 16 bars, they're playing exactly the same thing. So you just have this stereo thing that wants to carry the weight of the entire mix.
Yeah. So you mentioned the speed of the performance there. Do you have any observations about, obviously you've mixed Black Sabbath as well, and Metallica and the track that you've mixed here that's got really fast blast beats at like 200 BPM or whatever it is. Do you have any observations about the space that is available for the sonic weight for the low end with these drum performances?
It's tough. It's tough because most of those blast beats, you need the snare to have enough top end to be heard with the click of the kick. You can't make it heavy, that sort of 220 hertz thing that you'd bring up on a Neve to make the snare fat, because it's going way too fast for that. And there's cymbals involved, so the kit almost rises up. And when this goes to the halftime is when it actually feels heavy to me. I don't really get the heaviness except in the guitars with the riff when it's going fast. It's just, and that's my perspective as a listener. But it's also, I think, part of just my personal taste. I like slow, dark, sad, distorted things. And when they speed up too much, it's hard for me to kind of settle into it. So that's why I love the halftime part of this. That's, to me, when the track just drops and gets really heavy. Because again, you have the room in the mix. You're not trying to hear things as much. It's obvious what the drums are doing there.
The section that you mentioned, the breakdown in the middle of the song where there's more space, there's also some orchestral elements there. Do you see orchestral elements contributing towards this idea of perceptual heaviness?
I think it definitely can. I mean, interestingly, we talked about I don't work in this particular genre a huge amount. And I find especially the higher strings take away from the heaviness. It doesn't really work for me, but that's just a me thing. I don't think that's a general thing. But in that section we're talking about, the guitars go away. So the low end can only be the kick drum and the strings. And so I think at that point they are the heaviness. But to me, the heaviness came more from it slowing down. This release of all the tension that you've built up all the way through. So it's a tension and release thing more than a heavy thing, but the tempo helps. And then when the guitars are back in, then you've got the slow, heavy, dirgy riff, which that's what I respond to.
The performance elements that we're discussing there, that's obviously core components of heaviness, but moving away from performance and more moving towards technology. Obviously over the past half a century we've had all these technological developments that have largely facilitated heavier production, so increased track count, drum sample implementation and modern valve guitar amp technology. From here, where do you see it going as far as production's getting ever heavier, or have we released the end game, or how do you see technology developing to facilitate it any further?
I don't know. I mean, I think it's more driven by the taste, and the technology responds to that, and people develop things that people want. And every once in a while you have visionaries who develop things like, you know, the Lindrum that came out of kind of nowhere in a way because the technology could do it. But I don't know. I mean, you know, the fact that now you can sidechain 70 things in a session and they're all time adjusted so it works and all that. I mean, that definitely opens up possibilities if you're working, especially in this genre, at that sort of tempo. But I think it's more that you always think, like I said before with Back in Black, you thought, well, that's it. We've now hit the heaviest thing ever. And it really does, it sounds amazing still, but it sounds like a pop record. It does not sound like a heavy record. And I think it also goes in different directions. So you get the heavy versions of what could be pop songs. And I think in metal there may not be as much of it, but when you go to a band like Weezer, you know, they're writing almost pop songs, but they play them heavy. So that happens where the heaviness is sort of introduced into different songwriting veins. But then it's also just changing perception. You get used to something and it's no longer heavy. Some of it has to be that initial rush of adrenaline and the surprise and like, oh my God, I've never heard anything that heavy before. When you hear it the 10th time, it's not as heavy.
Interesting. And continuing from that perspective, when you get used to hearing something, it no longer is heavy. Do you feel that some lo-fi production productions or production techniques can be perceived as heavy? And do you use lo-fi production techniques yourself, or is high fidelity production techniques generally perceived as heavier and clarity?
I don't know. Again, I think that's really personal taste. I personally find some of the lo-fi stuff heavy, just to use the word to describe it. And I'm a fan of, I didn't do it on this track, but actually I did use some parallel distortion on the drums, because that really makes the mid-range dense. And I feel like when it's a wall, to me, that's heavy. Now, there are definitely other people producing metal who feel like the precision is more important. So having the cleaner sounds with space in between is what makes you hear what's going on. And I feel like with my mix, it's sort of a problem. I've built it up more like my rock mixes, and there isn't enough space for everything. And it's why the strings and the horns aren't doing maybe the job they're doing. So there's stuff I hear in my head that is not happening yet, but I couldn't really get there in a timely fashion. I just thought, well, I don't want to relearn how to mix to try and make this happen. But I do think some of it is just personal preference.
And from those personal preference perspectives, when you've mixed, obviously, Sabbath, Metallica, Linkin Park, what are your core approaches and what you're trying to achieve, and how do they vary between each project? We talked about the guitars and we talked about the harmonic distortion, but between each of those bands, how does your aesthetic of what you're trying to achieve, how is that affected by the performances and the speed of performance or the textures involved?
Well, I think for me, every mix is about the song. So I'm following the lead of what the arrangement is. But when you're working with a band like Metallica or Black Sabbath, obviously the history it has to be part of how you mix. Like, you're not going to not put a delay on Ozzy's vocal. He's never not had a delay, so you have to do that. And finding the right delay for his vocal was a big part of those mixes. And to the point where it actually made me think about slap delay more. And so now slap delay is a big part of what I do with vocals in general. So sometimes it is just being reminiscent of something you've heard before, which is different to hearing the same thing a lot of times, because I realize I'm almost contradicting myself in a way. So those bands have history in the sound, but in general, because of the things I like about music, which is the, sad, dark, distorted, slow, all that kind of thing, I'm always looking for those elements in any mix. Beyonce to Lana Del Rey to everything. So it is about, how can I make this low end just swamp you without killing the song? So it's always serving the song, but I am seeking out those elements that make me feel like it's compelling and you'd want to come back. And to do that, I feel like it has to be surprising. And the way to surprise people for me is to make things heavier than they would expect.
And those bands with the history that you talked about, with referencing the slap delay on Ozzy's vocal, you've also worked with a lot of other producers through the years. As one example, Rick Rubin. Of those producers that you've worked with, which of their production techniques has had a real influence on you when you've worked with these producers?
Oh, I mean, everybody you work with has an influence on you. And the good thing is you cherry pick. You take the things you like and you leave the things you don't. And it's interesting though, because I would say Rick, when you're in the mixing process, is very much about the precision and being able to hear everything, and that's but that's on everything. That's on every genre. It doesn't matter if it's Johnny Cash or Metallica. That's what he's looking for, is to hear everything about it. Whereas other producers are not necessarily about that, and they are more about just the overall picture of how this can fit together and explode out of the speakers or whatever. So, I've learned stuff from everybody about everything.
Yeah. And looking back on the albums you've produced, which are the albums that have been the most challenging to you and presented numerous challenges, and how did those albums turn out? And then also, which were the most straightforward albums with the least challenges, and how did they turn out?
I mean, every album is full of challenges, especially because for the most part, I've not produced multiple records with the band, so you don't have the history. So the first few days of actually being in the studio is all about learning what's going on. There's a band called Faves from Switzerland where it went really, really smoothly. We had 12 days in a studio to record 12 songs, and we decided very early on we are not going to do like 2 days of drums and a day of bass. We said we're going to start every single day with pre-production on the song that we will finish that day. And we actually managed to do it, other than background vocals. Everything was done by the time we stopped that day, and then the next day we started up a new song. And because somehow we just got into the groove of doing that, it ended up going really well. And we were all on the same page, and the sounds that we got first worked, and we were switching things up between songs, which is something you normally don't do. You're tracking 12 songs of drums, you've got a day and a half, you don't change stuff. But this was every morning, you're fresh, you've just had some breakfast, you don't mind going out there and moving microphones, putting some tape on some stuff, and like, let's try that guitar amp. But you do it really quickly, and then you're in the flow of it, and it works for that song, and you're not worried about other stuff. There's also a band called Motorpsycho, who are one of my favorite bands from Norway, from Trondheim, where also great pedals are made. Yeah. And it was really difficult because I've been a huge fan of theirs for a really long time. And in my head, I had the versions of the records they'd already made, and like, oh, wouldn't it be great if it sounded like this? And it's arrogant to think that somehow they hadn't achieved the sonic thing they were looking for, but now I have the chance to work with them and I will give them what they want. They were absolutely getting what they wanted. And so it was really challenging for me to completely shift my perspective on what the end product was going to be while tracking with them for the first time ever. Had only talked to them once after a show, did not do pre-production because we couldn't. They're in Norway, I was here. And to just show up in the studio and and also we were trying to record, I don't know, 70 minutes of music in 10 days or something like that. So that was difficult, but also incredibly rewarding when you get to the end of it. So, I mean, I don't know if difficult is really the word. It's just a lot of work sometimes. But even the Faves record was a ton of work, but I feel like we all kind of were on the same page immediately and just stayed there.
Yeah. We were chatting before about the way that you look at the low end of modern metal albums, and sometimes it's not really the kick drum that's in the low end, it's the guitars, and it's providing space for the guitars. What are the sort of trade-offs and limitations of some of your mix tactics? In other words, with increased drum cohesion, does that result in less clarity? Or with, for example, thicker, denser guitar tones, it's also difficult for other instrument clarity. What are the sort of trade-offs that you're trying to negotiate with mixing rock and metal albums?
Well, I think with the rock albums, it's okay to be dense and for the guitars to be more mid-range. But on, like we were saying before, where the bass is generally doubling the guitars, the bass ends up with presence in the mid-range because of the distortion and things like that, but their low end is just being borrowed by the guitars in a lot of ways because they're playing the same parts most of the time. So, and on this mix it was the same thing. I was struggling with, oh, I can't hear the bass. I can't hear the bass. Well, let me turn up the distortion. Well, that's fine, but I still can't hear the bass. And then you mute the bass, and it's like, oh, right, yeah, I can hear the bass, no problem. It just doesn't separate as much. And again, I think one of the problems with what I usually do is my mixes are very dense, and there isn't a lot of room, which means there isn't space around things, which means that the entire mix is taking up more space, where what I really wanted was for the guitars to take up more space. And for me, because of the way I mix, it was really difficult. I never really even got there. I don't feel like I managed to give enough room for the guitars to be as important as they're supposed to be. So instead, they're a bit louder, but they're not necessarily as full frequency as I'd like because I can't leave the drums that clean. It just bugs me. I can't do it. So the distortion on the kit starts filling things up that you don't want it to fill up.
Right. So continuing with that theme of the distortion on the guitars and potentially saturating the drums, like you've got the Scheps Omni used, giving quite a lot of saturation. How do you approach saturation, distortion, clipping, those processing approaches with mixes? Obviously it's very dependent on the textures involved, but where do you see distortion and saturation? Do you see them as textural, or do you see them as creating more cohesion between the drums and guitars, or what's your sort of...
Well, I mean, we can talk specifically about drums for a second, because there is parallel distortion on the drums, there is also direct distortion on the drums. And with that, it came from, and I have no idea what mix it was, but there was a mix where the drums felt too tight. And they needed not more space, they needed more length. They just needed to feel like they were in a better sounding room when they were recorded. And I tried kind of things you can do to room mics, like the UAD Oceanway plugin is fantastic for that, because it does, I mean, it's still reverb, but it does what they call remiking. And it does feel a little bit more like the microphones were in a different room rather than reverb. But everything I tried just sounded unnatural and weird. It just sounded like reverb. And then I thought, well, what can lengthen these drums? Well, distortion, because it takes longer to go away afterwards. It has a shape to it. And so I came up with some parallel distortion chains and really tweaked one over the course of the next 4 or 5 mixes. And now it's in my template. And it is usually just used in choruses. I think in this song it might be all the way through, but it's generally used to kind of beef the drums up. But then away from the drums, in general, harmonic distortion gives you more audio to work with when you're EQing. So that's why I like it. You can do a half dB in the mid-range on something that's distorted, and that is a gigantic difference. And without the distortion, it's sort of only the notes that have things close to that frequency, unless you're doing a really broad EQ, but then that's the same as turning it up, and why would you do it? So to really be able to make things poke out of a mix, you can be much more specific with the EQ and tighter on the cue itself, because there is more information at all frequencies. And so that's what I like about it. But the trade-off, and with that and parallel compression, is there's just a lot less space in the mix. My mixes are very dense to the point where it upsets me sometimes, because it'd be so easy if I had more room, and I turn all that stuff down and I just don't like it. So it comes back up.
Yeah. And that principle with the distortion, lengthening the drum sounds, almost getting more sustain out of them, is that a similar principle with parallel compression? Is it more about texture, or is it more about transient design?
It's more about texture. The parallel compression is more about the envelope of the sounds. But then again, a lot of my parallel compression, I will be smashing it. So as I bring that up, there's some distortion in it as well, but it is more about just the difference between serial and parallel compression. You know, the normal thing of, I want to bring the quiet stuff up and leave the transients, especially in drums, of the loud stuff alone, whereas straight compression would bring those transients down. So it doesn't work exactly like that, but in my head that's how it works, and it does feel that way, where I can keep that almost surprisingly loud transient of the snare, but then give it more length because you're bringing up the decay of it. And by sharing the parallel compression between the entire drum kit, you don't just make the snare do something which is now covering up the next kick drum or something like that. So every drum hit will drive that compressor, and it just helps glue things together, the way I hear it. But again, it also has detrimental effects of taking up way more space, and it doesn't leave space for other stuff.
And the idea that we're discussing here of sort of transient design and texture, lengthening the drums to sort of provide more density and more impact. From chatting with you previously, you have said that you're not a particular fan of room mics, feeling that there's not enough phase coherence to the room mics.
Well, I don't remember saying that. Did I say that?
Yeah, that you...
Well, I think it was in the context of what I will do quite often is, it's not necessarily the phase relationship of the room mics, it's more the delay not in terms of phase, but in terms of smearing the transient of the snare. So
Right.
what I will do sometimes is take the room mics and actually line them up to the snare, if I can get rid of some of the low end, because unfortunately the kick and the snare don't ever seem to have the same delay in the room mics. Like how that is possible, I have no idea. But generally I will line them up to the snare and then they act like a reverb because this transient is there. What I don't like is smearing the transient by having that delay.
Yeah. And when you're creating drum samples from the kit used for tracking, again, something we've chatted about previously, that you quite often favour creating drum samples from the kit used for tracking with different mixes of those sources to create the drum samples. Do you therefore tend to stay away from the room mics or try different combinations of?
No, actually the way I do it is right after we're done tracking, I then have the drummer play the drums, you know, couple velocities, nothing crazy. But I just record the multi-track. And what those are for is when there's a mishit snare or didn't get the rim on that hit, I will actually cut the entire drum kit to put it in. And if there's a cymbal that I don't have or something, then I'll cheat by keeping overheads or whatever I need to do. But sometimes one snare hit will sound weird and it's nothing to do with the snare track. So I will keep all of those multi-track. I almost never mix them down and make samples for me to use somewhere else.
Right.
Every once in a while, but yeah, not very often.
Brilliant. So we've discussed all the ideas about perceptual heaviness and different genres and performances and how that contributes to the perspectives of perceived heaviness. I think it'd be great to have a look at the mix and have a look at the challenges that were presented with this multi-track.
Yeah, great. I mean, there were definitely some challenges. It's very dense. There's a lot going on. You know, and there's some stuff I don't feel like I got quite right, not what I was hearing, but yeah, let's see what I tried to do.
Yeah, we got this, the track that you actually mixed, it was deliberately meant to present some challenges where you go from slow half-time beats into blast beats with layers of harmonized operatic vocals, and you got so many performance events with down-tuned guitars, slower low frequency wavelengths, so there's definitely some real challenges.
Yeah, and I
this
think
mix.
we'll see as we dig into the session, like one of the things we talked about earlier is this idea of distortion on the drums to do what reverb might, except that on this track, it had to go to reverb. Because in the halftime breakdown, where there are no guitars, that snare has to fill up a room. So there are things I'm doing that sort of go against what I would normally do, just to make it work musically. So yeah.
Perfect. Let's have a look.